I think the time has come for allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they have put on the use of weapons they have donated to Ukraine, because especially now when a lot of the fighting is going on in Kyiv, close to the border, to deny Ukraine the possibility of using these weapons against legitimate military targets on Russian territory makes it very hard for them to defend themselves.
So to be clear, you're asking the US to lift the restrictions on the use of American weapons over Russian territory?
I believe the time has come for allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they have imposed on weapons donated to Ukraine. Because we need to remember what this is. This is a war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to defend themselves, and that includes also striking targets on Russian territory.
Yeah, so I think Jens Stoltenberg here made a very, diplomatic approach to what he wants to say and what he wants to communicate. He's not saying, you guys have to do it because of this and that, and this is my prerogative to dictate this policy. As some of you guys know that I watch Italian media a little bit, and today has been an absolute shit show in Italian media, and yesterday as well. And a couple of Italian very prominent politicians even went as far as saying Stoltenberg has to immediately step down and as the General Secretary of NATO and apologize. I went on a little Twitter rant with a Italian journalist working for a newspaper that is owned by, well, Berlusconi is dead, but it was a Berlusconi newspaper. And he's like, oh, this is escalation. If we allow this, it's gonna start the Third World War. Yeah, it's the typical talking points, right? And there's no, evidence that Russia will, change some of its behavior or is even able to escalate anything. So it doesn't make any sense. And if we go back to the map, Russia deems Crimea and, I don't know, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk, apparently that is Russia, right? But they don't care if Western weapons are being used there, even if they think it's their sovereign territory. But yeah, these people that are arguing against this thing, I don't know what they have. Lack of ability to analyze these things, or just have some certain personal convictions or motivations to spread disinformation and fear about these topics, and it really frustrates me.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the people who sort of argue this do seem to be arguing it in bad faith. But it does seem like, pretty clearly, like in the Biden administration, there are some high-level people, Big Sullivan, but others who sort of advocate this strategy, right? That they seem to genuinely believe, and like I don't know how much we can say here exactly, but like we've asked some sources as close to the White House as we can get, and that seems to be the genuine belief that they are they genuinely believe that this is nuclear escalate. This will result in some kind of an escalation, and that escalation could eventually result in a nuclear kind of situation. Basically, that's the thing that they are saying, even when they don't think the media is listening or like other people are listening, right? So I would say that it's mostly, as far as I can tell, like in the public square, like all the people who are somewhat reasonable, like in Europe and mostly in the United States, are saying, like, for example, if you ask like someone at the Pentagon, like, should they be allowed to do this? For the most part, they say yes. Again, assuming like the targets are all correct and all that. But yeah, there do seem to be a few prominent members of certain governments that, and I think Schultz we could maybe put in this category. Germinate to Ukraine is free to disagree with me, but I think there are politicians who really have that line of thinking, and it's a real obstacle to Ukraine prosecuting the war successfully. Ultimately, they're going to need to. I think that's pretty evident to win. So if I think we're all probably everyone watching and like everyone on the panel, like we're all on the same page that we're in favor of Ukraine doing this. I think it's more we're kind of interrogating like how the argument around it has been shaped, right? And maybe the potential for that, the dynamic there to shift. So Erlen, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of show on the map here, right? So this is after the drawback, like the Russian, when they tried to invade Kyiv, right? They drew back, and since then, until the latest incursion in the Kharkiv region, the Russians have only been attacking from inside the recognized territories of Ukraine. They didn't attack over the Russian-Ukrainian border directly. And the problem of utilizing or the restrictions that Ukraine has had on utilizing Western-provided weapons on the, in Russia proper, in what is recognized Russian territory, it's been there for a long time. I would say we can even go back to when did they first get HIMARS and Gimlers? It was probably about May, wasn't it?
About
2022. Yeah. And already then, and now the map is not loading properly, but already back then the problem existed, right? It wasn't something that just happened overnight. But since the Russians were massing troops and their logistical train had to go through Ukrainian occupied territories, we know the results that the Ukrainians had hitting those logistical spots with, for instance, Gimlers or Western provided munitions such as Excalibur. Later on, of course, in 2023, they started hitting Crimea with Western provided missiles as well when the Scalp PG and the Storm Shadows were provided. But all of this time, it would have been a lot more efficient for Ukraine to be able to hit within Russian territory, but they weren't allowed to. And they've, of course, behind the scenes been trying to push the Americans to change this stance, and apparently they did manage to change the stance of the French and the UK, and also now a couple of other European countries, like today Sweden did an announcement about this as well. They absolutely support the use of the Swedish weaponry provided.
I was hoping Colby was here to go through the breakdown, but like you said, as far as I can tell, like most of the European countries have issued some kind of general statement that they're in favor of this and that they kind of don't appreciate the U.S. kind of restriction. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean the thing is, this was always a problem, but if we go to today, this problem evidences itself. Or not necessarily today, a couple of weeks ago when the incursion started here, the problem is a lot more evident than it was a year ago, because now the Russians are attacking straight over the Russian border, which means where's their logistical train? Well, it's behind the Russian border. What has been the absolutely most successful Ukrainian tactic? Well, it's been hitting Russian logistics and ruining their command posts, taking out all of these really, really critical nodes that the Russians need to be able to perform offensive maneuvers. But now they're not allowed to do so, not just with American provided weapons, but also with Western provided weapons. That means if Norway or Sweden or the UK provided artillery munition to Ukraine, the Americans are saying you're not allowed to use that artillery munition to shoot over the border. You have to wait till the Russians cross the border before you actually are allowed to use that munition to hit them. And I think that it could be one of the reasons why the Russians didn't push over the border here in the first place, because now this problem is evidencing itself so strongly, manifesting itself so strongly, that I think there is no way that the US can keep on this absolutely ridiculous restriction that they are imposing on the Ukrainians. Yeah, end rant.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just maybe wanted to clarify. I don't know if Germany to Ukraine is feels like talking today, but it's just saying I think maybe it would be an overstatement to say most European countries. I think that's probably fair. Maybe exaggerated to say most. And also, he just mentioned specifically that Italy said something basically against it today, and I forget who, but another country has also said something against it. So there's some countries are definitely against it, but the UK, who has provided long-range missiles, I'd say maybe Germany is a bit, mixed on this.
No, it's a clear no.
Clear no, yeah. So
Yeah.
go ahead, Daniel.
No, I was just looking at the news, and it's confirmed that Chancellor Scholz have said that he opposed the use of any Western weapon for Ukraine strike on Russian territory. I don't want to rant, so I close my mic.
This stuff is basically telling Ukrainians, you're not allowed to shoot at someone who's shooting at you until they cross this drawn up line on a piece of paper back in 1700s or whatever, whenever they started making these borders. It is absolutely disgusting behavior. It makes me so pissed.
You know what's funny? So first of all, yes, I'm able to talk today. Yeah. The comment about Scholz, he was asked today, right? He does one thing in Germany, he goes to every federal state and he does a Bürgerdialog. So basically, they have 100 people in a room or outside. They are randomly chosen and they can ask all the questions. And he does this in every federal state, right? And today, he had one of those, and he was asked when finally there was an older man, and he asked when will be the time when we finally allow Ukraine to strike on Russian territory? And he explained that he is the children of the Cold War, when he had to fear that Eastern Germany and Russia attacked the Western Germany, stuff like this. He explained all of that. And the question was just, when are we allowing Ukraine to strike on Russian territory, right? And Scholz just answered that he didn't even said no or yes. He basically just explained that they have rules, or they have not commitment. Commitments is the wrong word. Basically, they have rules. They have agreed on specific terms how to use the weapons. And funny enough, he said, and this is working, right? It's Ukraine is doing that, and I heard that today, and immediately my mind was going back to the Taurus topic when he basically explained that he doesn't trust Ukraine enough to actually do so. But on another day, on another topic, he said it's working that way, and basically, why should we change anything when it's working, right? And it's just, I don't know. Basically, when he says it's working, why isn't he saying, okay, you can strike on that target inside Russia, but only on military targets, right? The German Minister of Defense, for example, he was a couple of weeks in the office, so pretty new, and he went on German television, Boris Pistorius, and said in the television while new in office, it's totally fine to strike on Russian targets, Russian target inside of Russia, as long as they are military targets, right? And that was a year ago or so, and since then, I don't know, why isn't he not saying, when Scholz is publicly saying Ukraine is trustable and they're doing what they have agreed on, why isn't he saying, okay, you can attack on Russian soil, but only on military targets, when he's really trusting them and when they really did everything they want? There shouldn't be any issue. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree. And just to add a bit of more military context to the problem of not being able to strike in Russia on military target, is the situation, for example, in Vovchansk. Correct me, Erland, if I'm wrong. But
That was good.
Oh, thank you. Finally, I got one. So I had I went on many channels on Telegram, and I had the chance to drop a couple of messages with some people working down there. And one of the biggest issue that they are currently having in pushing away the Russian is the problem that they are constantly bombed from Russian territory. And of course, there is already a gap, let's say, in quantity of ammunition that they have. But the strikes start from Belgorod, artillery and Grad and many other type of indirect fire systems are in Russian territory, sometimes even in civilian areas. And so they can't fire back always or most of the time. Yeah, that forest, you are essentially looking at people that were there. And this is completely terrible, because how we can ask to a nation that is defending itself to defend itself without defending itself? Because if someone is shooting on you, you should be able at least to retaliate on the military target, doing the best you can to minimize any collateral damage. And Ukraine has a perfect track record of this. Very, very few times we have seen civilian involved, because be sure of one thing: the first Russian that dies due to a bomb launched by Ukraine, we will know this immediately. And so far, there is essentially nothing, because they did precise strike on military installation. So, and also in timing where they were not that populated when the strike happened in populated area. So I really cannot reason myself why this should happen. And I really hope that with the many nations in Europe saying that for them it's fine, there will be more consensus around this, because we have seen how this goes. Someone say you can do this, you can receive this weapon, you can do this, then Russia starts to say, oh, this is an escalation, this will bring a nuclear retaliation, this will bring a nuclear war. Then nothing happened for weeks, then others follow, and then finally sometimes Scholz follow, and also US. So, but the problem is that the war dragged so far because we allowed this. There were a lot of issues, of course, also on Ukrainian side. The mobilization, defense is not always built in time, but also, I mean, the support and the power that we project is very poor, because we are not able to say, this is a military target. You strike from your own territory. You are now a military target. You can get shot. No, you can't, because we don't know why. And I think this fear of escalation is what is bringing us to the escalation, because we are not impeding the enemy to do what he's doing. And by not providing any response to their terrorist way of conducting this war, like the striking on Kharkiv last day, I mean, we are provoking the escalation, because we are allowing Russia to do what it's doing. Instead, if they knew that we have been strong and say, okay, you do this, you get that, they would think twice. And this is also why many months ago, Macron started to say, no, we should not remove from the table the possibility to send troops. Because in the moment that we say that we won't do, we give the adversary an advantage. And he's going to use this, because he have done for 3 years now. Sorry for my rant as well. I tried to put some, and this is particularly important for Kharkiv area, because it's on the border. How they can protect their border if they can get shell from another nation and they cannot retaliate?
Yeah, I just wanted to show, like, so the Russians are conducting, operations in these areas, right? They assaulted these areas with infantry and some mechanized infantry as well, of course supported by their own artillery. And if we just place 35 to be conservative, 35-kilometer range circles. You see where the Russians can shoot artillery, rocket artillery, and also, of course, the glide bombs, which have a lot more reach than this, up to 80 kilometers. And the Ukrainians are not allowed to perform counter battery fire even. And how are you supposed to even dig defenses and really do that in this kind of situation where you're not allowed to take out Russian artillery positions on the other side of the border? I understand that Ukrainian troops didn't want to dig the defenses along the border when they knew that they would be obvious targets from the other side, and they're not allowed to use their most effective artillery to take out those positions firing at them. It's ridiculous.
And it's a military nonsense.
Yeah,
Completely.
like
you are allowing the enemy to have a safe zone where he can plan and strike, because in theory they cannot even use HIMARS. So in theory they can even mass troop there. We can see them, but no, for Christ's sake, we can't strike them on Russian territory. So they have to be attacked just when they cross the border, which is completely a nonsense.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense militarily at all. And the absurdness of this situation is now becoming very evident, and that's why I think maybe one of the reasons why the Russians didn't launch attacks this way, because whenever the US is going to lift this ridiculous restriction on the Ukrainian military, that's going to open up for a whole lot more, which the Russians don't want, which it would be striking on with Western provided missiles on, for instance, Rostov-on-Don, in Kursk, Voronezh, all of these obvious military targets where they do have their fighter planes and bomber planes, which are harassing the Ukrainians every day with these glide bombs. They would all be then in the scope of the targets that the Ukrainians can prosecute with long-range missiles provided by the West. And the Russians obviously don't want this. So I think this could... I'm confident that this whole situation here is going to, and also, of course, what is happening inside Kharkiv city, is going to basically make sure that the US will change this. Of course, it's too late already, but it will be a big problem for the Russians whenever that restriction is lifted.
Yeah,
sorry,
Go on, Joseph. Please go on.
Oh, yeah. Well, we have a question in chat, which I think is worth addressing, which is Biden and the U.S. forcing other allies like the U.K. from not striking inside Russia? So in my understanding, this sort of assertion comes from President Zelensky in an interview, basically said this very clearly. And do we have any other kind of proof of this, Erlen? Because it's definitely a true assertion. I'm just saying it's a totally fair question for people to ask, where is that information coming from? And that's my understanding. It's coming from Zelensky saying it in an interview. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's been leaking from Ukraine as well.
Yeah.
I think Colby knows better, but when the Ukrainian president is saying that, I think that's a good enough source.
People who've been paying attention have been saying this has been the case for, I would say, at least a year, probably longer. But the confirmation from the president, I think, is maybe partly why it's become such a public issue now. Maybe. But Colby, if you wanted to say anything about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's been something that's been obvious for quite some time to anybody who's been watching this war. And every day we just get more information coming out either from Zelensky himself or other Ukrainian officials that this is the case. Some of us are told things as well, which are not open source, that corroborate all of this as well. But if you just use what's publicly available and think about it for 2 seconds, it's pretty clear that this prohibition extends to pretty much everything, because even though Lord Cameron has said that the United Kingdom doesn't have a problem with this, we still haven't seen any Storm Shadow strikes on Russian Federation territory. So obviously there's something else afoot here that's preventing Ukraine from using those cruise missiles to do that. Otherwise, they would. There's plenty of targets, plenty of need. Obviously, Ukrainian armed forces have been expressing very clearly that they cannot, there's nothing they can do about the fact that the Russians are hitting them from just over the border, and they can't even respond to that. So that's the state of play right now. The White House is pressuring Ukraine, threatening Ukraine, really blackmailing Ukraine, because Zelensky said that we can't put all of the weapons at risk in the context of we're being told not to execute these strikes on Russia, and if they were to not abide by that, which they obviously have been, if they were to not abide by that, he said that would put all of the donated weapons at risk, implying that there would be a cutoff of military assistance to Ukraine if it starts striking Russian territory.
Yeah. And I think this is going to change because there's going to be a lot more pressure now. And it's going to be a lot more obvious for these politicians that really don't seem to understand what they're imposing on the Ukrainians by doing this, how big of a disadvantage it puts on Ukraine. And the Russians are surely going to push this in more areas if they see that the Americans are continuing with this absurdness. And I hope that some military advisors in the US will start shouting about this, because I'm certain that there's going to be a lot of officers that are really frustrated with this absolutely absurd situation when we see strikes, going into big cities like Kharkiv and Sumy. And the situation is going to be really, really difficult for Ukraine because they are not allowed to not even shoot down airplanes if they're in Russian airspace, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that. This is another point, because they cannot even use air defense to shoot down airplane, which are causing a lot of issues. So, and that would be, at least, that is a military target going to shoot to you, and they cannot even do that.
Well, wait. I think, Colby, can you correct me if I'm wrong? They have shot down a Russian bomber with a PAC-1 Patriot inside Russian territory, or is that mistaken?
But it was German.
So they use the German Patriot batteries to shoot down Russian aircraft in Russian territory, and at least some of the missiles were American. It was a standard missile, actually, not even a PAC-1, which was bewildering to John and I, because we didn't even think any of those still existed in a storage, let alone even work, because those are even older than ATACMS. So yes, that did happen. It caused major issues, a major diplomatic incident with the German government, probably the White House as well, obviously, because it was their missile, or at least one of them was their missile. But it was the German batteries that were used to do that.
There's also been a few incidents of Western artillery grenades being launched over the border, but I don't think that's necessarily been totally sanctioned by the Ukrainian government because of the rarity that it happened. But I remember seeing an Excalibur round that was a dud that ended up somewhere in Belgorod Oblast. And I think even back then people were like, "Oh no, the Ukrainians are violating this rule that the Americans put on the restriction on using munitions over the border." But nothing really happened. So I'm not sure if Ukraine could, stretch this a little bit, but they're obviously decided not to, since they're not using Gimlers and other munitions to strike obvious, really imminent threats on the other side of the border.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we were fair-handed in our understanding of what the terms of these restrictions are. And I think Colby illustrated correctly that this is a situation where they did it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't a restriction there, because it looks like the German government, and as he's correctly said, probably the US government, objected to how Ukraine did that. And since then, I don't think we've seen that specific means used to down a Russian aircraft. So that would imply, right, that this is part of the restriction. So I think that what Daniela said originally is probably still fair, that this is part of the restriction, that they can't even down aircraft with air defense, that is shooting at them inside Russian territory. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Aaron.
They cannot. I mean, this was asked at the Secretary of Defense, and he refused to, he said, oh, well, I'm not going to, play these games and walk through all these different scenarios. They're not allowed to do anything. Yes, there have been these various isolated incidences in which they have returned fire, either shot down aircraft, or there has been artillery fire across the border. Some HARM missiles have ended up in Belgorod as well. None of this is allowed with HARM. I mean, they can really just there's plausible deniability there, the way that they're using HARM to some degree.
HARM's like an anti-radar missile, so I assume you're saying the plausible deniability would be, well, it seeks radars, and it just...
Yeah, I mean, they could say, oh, well, we were trying to target something that was on our side of the border, and then there was a shutdown, and then it veered off course. They can make up some dumb excuse about how that happened. But none of this is allowed. And when it does happen, the Ukrainians, do hear about it. So they aren't, there's been no pattern of Ukraine being able to return fire, right? These are all isolated incidences that don't happen with any frequency, because they know that they can't do it. There would be severe consequences if they just fully disregarded the policy, or that's the message that's been communicated to Zelensky. Again, he said himself, we can't put all of the donated weapons at risk by failing to abide by this policy. So his understanding is that they're going to be cut off if they were to formally reject that policy. They would suffer the consequences of that. And otherwise, they're just managing these isolated incidences when they occur.
So we got a couple of questions in chat, Erlen, but I guess maybe to sort of wrap up our discussion of it, maybe unless you had other points, but I think my take on this would be what we would want at a bare minimum is just for the U.S. to, in this restriction, this blanket restriction on all weapons from every country. In other words, if the UK is in favor of it, just the U.S. shouldn't be standing in their way, right? And I think by doing that in practice, eventually, even though the US or Germany or other countries might hem and haw about it, it will show that this idea that it will cause a nuclear war is absurd, right? And so what's the difference ultimately if the UK is doing it but the US isn't, or is, right? You know what I mean? So I think that would be the path towards getting a more sensible policy on this, or do you see kind of a different path?
Well, I think the Americans are going to play that card if they're going to change that. I do believe they're going to change their policy, mainly because they don't want to be seen as some sort of provocateur in any way or form. So if they're going to change this policy, yes, I think that's probably where they're going to start. They're going to say that, yeah, we're not going to, impose absurd restrictions on other countries' provided weapons, and then we'll see that the Ukrainians are going to use them exactly like they've used them within their own territory occupied by Russia, and they've hit crucial military installations and logistics points and people assembling for training areas in the deserts south of Kherson. Very, very successfully took out a lot of Russian military capabilities that would have ended up if they didn't take them out with long range weapons supplied by the West. It would have all ended up inside their country, creating damage and death. And that's what the Ukrainians are going to use these weapons for. They're going to take out whatever is going to end up in their country anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one other point kind of came to mind while I was thinking about this, and then we'll go to the chat questions, which is just like, what is the mechanism by which the U.S. is doing this? As my guess would be, and maybe Colby, you could comment on this, the U.S., there's a lot of, let's say in a Taurus missile or whatever, right, bad example, but there's a lot of U.S. technologies in it. So the U.S. could, in theory, like restrict, quote unquote, Western weapons being used, probably on the grounds of like certain technology being in them. Or do you think there's like a different mechanism they're using to pressure other governments from not allowing Ukraine to use the weapons properly? Or is it a more informal diplomatic thing? Like, how do you think that works?
Yeah, so it's not any sort of restriction that is imposed on the donor countries. It is a demand or a threat made directly to the Ukrainian government that they shouldn't use any of these Western systems to strike Russia. So the threat is to Ukraine. It's not them going to the United Kingdom or Germany or any other country saying, we don't want Ukraine to do this. They're just going straight to the Ukrainians and saying, don't do it. I don't think they're making the case that, like, our technology is in this weapon, so you can't do that. Although that's maybe the case in a lot of these weapons.
I guess
pretty,
to clarify,
pretty uncommon to have something without U.S. components in it, but it's like that's not really the route that it's being done.
Right. I guess, again, that's what gives the threat weight, right? That they could do that in theory. Like when they're telling that to Ukraine, that's like, that would be how they would follow through on said threat. Sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Right. But I mean, my understanding is that there's, they're not threatening to withhold any sort of third-party transfer requests necessarily. It's more that, we're not going to keep supplying you if you do this on the grounds that we just believe it's too escalatory for Western weapons to be striking Russia. And obviously they don't like Ukraine even using their indigenous drones to do this either. I mean, President Zelensky said that the United States was not happy with us, the fact that we're using our drones to target Russian energy infrastructure. You had the Assistant Secretary of Defense Wallander saying that, we don't believe that, we believe that those are civilian targets. They're not legitimate military targets. Russia's, these energy infrastructure strikes. So the White House policy is very clear that they don't like any of this, even with the Ukrainian weapons. But they don't, they haven't gone so far to tell Ukraine to just, threaten them if they even use their own drones. But they don't like that either. But they are using, they are making the threat that, we're going to cut you guys off if you use any of these higher order systems, whether it be Storm Shadow or anything the United States provides itself. None of that should be used to hit Russian territory.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's like an informal, as you said, threat. I don't think that's basically a fair word that's made to the Ukrainian government versus any kind of arrangement between any of the other countries. So I think with that, so thank you, Colby. I think with that, we can go to the chat questions, Erlen, unless you wanted to wrap this up a different way.
Well, there were a couple of questions. I don't know if Quiet Gao today is going to be answering them, but I lost it. But it was basically someone asked if Gao thinks that Scholz is going to change his opinion about this.
I mean, there's always the possibility. I think it comes down to Biden, right? We have seen with pretty much everything else that Scholz looks up to Biden, and when Biden says no, then Scholz is most of the time also against it. So I've already said it in the past that I think that when the US provides a similar capability to Ukraine, that Scholz would also agree on sending the Taurus cruise missile to Ukraine. Therefore, I am still think and also think in this situation that if the US says it's totally fine to strike on Russian targets, or strikes on Russian targets inside of Russia, then Scholz will do the same. I think it just comes down to the US. But otherwise, no.
Thank you, Quiet Go, for the response.
Yeah.
So I think that was it. Basically, we touched upon most of the questions. I guess this one we didn't really directly answer, but Kellen asks, who in the White House is the most hawkish Ukraine supporter? Blinken? And who is the most cowardly? Sullivan? Just curious on your thoughts. Well, it's really difficult to get into the heads of these people from the outside, right? But from what we've seen, Blinken has been at least trying to portray himself as a little bit more hawkish, and I guess it's fair to assume that he is that Joseph? You're the American here. I don't want to really comment on. I don't really like to comment on U.S. politics.
I think even though Colby is Canadian, I think he probably has a better grasp of the workings of the administration than me. So I'll defer to Colby if you have an opinion on that, Colby. But I couldn't really say it like a I don't know. But that's probably, I'll say that's probably accurate. Kellen's like Blinken versus Sullivan thing. But I don't know if you had anything to say about it, Colby.
Well, this came out, was it Friday, in the New York Times, that Blinken is lobbying for the United States to change this policy on Ukraine not being able to strike into Russian territory, and that's something that most observers who have any sort of understanding of the dynamics at play here have understood for some time. But now we have this public reporting that confirms that Blinken is lobbying for this, but as well that it's not it's not just Jake Sullivan. The article actually explicitly says that like President Biden is actually like the most cautious person in his own administration. And so Jake Sullivan's a very convenient scapegoat for a lot of different people, for a lot of different motivations. So yes, Sullivan is a problem, but fundamentally, he's just doing his job, which is he works for the president. Everybody works for the president, but his own views clearly are much more aligned with the president's own views, and he has a big role in executing the administration's overall policy with regard to Ukraine. So even though Blinken is personally much closer to President Biden because he's Secretary of State and he's spending a lot of time flying around the world, one of the questions for me is like, how often does Blinken even get to make his case to the president that Ukraine should be provided with more support? Because Sullivan has the advantage of him being the National Security Advisor. He's there running the NSC every day in Washington. He has the most easy access to the president. So the two of them together, are really getting their way. I mean, obviously the president's going to get his way, but clearly Blinken has not been successful thus far in convincing the president that they should pursue a different policy. And I can't think of anybody else in the administration in any sort of senior capacity that sees more eye to eye with Blinken on this question. And the article by David Sanger, mentioned that there's President Biden, and I don't even know if it mentioned Sullivan by name, but it just said that Blinken's got to convince the inner circle of advisors to President Biden, which presumably Austin, perhaps Chairman Brown and others included in that equation. But it seems like it's very much Sullivan against the world here, with the president who himself is very, very cautious. And I would say is the main reason why this policy exists, because he believes fundamentally that this is just too risky to change course here. Sullivan obviously agrees, and the details of all these policies are ultimately left up to Jake to implement.
I guess we just have one final quick question for Colby, and then we'll wrap up, unless the panel has anything they want to add. Colby, how many cluster ATACMS are still available, if there's an estimation? in the
Well,
U.S. stocks?
yeah, I mean, to answer that question, we would have to know how many Ukraine has been given so far, which we don't have a super reliable number available. Well, really any number, right? It's basically been suggested that there's certainly over 100 ATACMS total that's been provided to Ukraine at this point in time. So it's hard to say with any certainty where that leaves us. I just refer people to my thread, all my graphs. You can see what the inventory was and where things stand now. Again, like it just depends on how many Ukraine's been given, and I doubt that we're going to get a precise counting, nor should we. That should not be something that's out there in the public, because you don't want the Russians to know how many are left. But people can see what the inventory was. There were like 1,200 roughly ATACMS that were in the quote unquote expired inventory, and my position is that all of those should be given to Ukraine. I doubt all of them will, but at least Ukraine has gotten some more, and hopefully they continue to receive more on an ongoing basis, because they have been firing them at quite a high rate. Actually, there have been a lot of ATACMS strikes lately, so Ukraine needs a very sustained ongoing delivery of those if they're going to try and keep pace, and then ultimately they will run out because it is a finite resource, which is why it is so important now that F-16s should soon be arriving. They really need some new long-range strike capabilities, whether it be SLAM ER or JASSM, both ideally. That's really the next fight here.
Okay,
go
ahead.
Yeah, we got another question from Kellen on a related topic. So basically, are HIMARS less effective with Russian jamming now, like scalable rounds, JDAMs, etc.? And is the West helping Ukraine counter Russian jamming in a meaningful way? So what I would say about the last thing is that any of these, the information about the West helping Ukraine with jamming or providing systems with jamming is probably never going to be talked about publicly, and hopefully it won't. Anything related to jamming is generally very restricted in the information space from both sides, and you've seen probably most of the audience have seen devices like the anti-FPV drone devices that are jamming FPV drones. Those are not conventional military jamming systems that are very restricted, and they're also not really that advanced. But when we're talking about jamming that affects these kind of weaponry, then we're talking about a lot more sensitive equipment and technology, and we're probably not going to get a lot of information about it. Do you have any other comments, Colby, about that?
I just clarify, like, it's not HIMARS that's affected, it's GIMLRs, right? It's the actual missiles themselves, right? That's what's getting jammed. The Russians aren't jamming the launchers, they are jamming the projectiles in flight. So yes, GIMLRs and all GPS guided munitions are impacted by Russian jamming. They are constantly, the United States working with Ukraine are constantly working on trying to mitigate the GPS denial from Russian electronic warfare. They have mitigated this to some degree. It affects other systems more than others. So Excalibur is impacted a lot more. Ground launched small diameter bomb is been significantly impacted, and there's other issues beyond the fact that there's this GPS denial. But those are two systems that have been quite affected. GIMLRs, JDAM, ERs, these are still working. There's this misplaced idea that they just don't work at all. That's not true. They are impacted, but they can still be used. There's a lot of different factors that go into this, right? Like Russian jamming, Russian EW is not uniform across the front, right? So in some sectors, it may be more effective than other sectors, depending on what's being targeted, how deep is the target. There's a lot that goes into this, so it's variable. So they still do work. There's not total GPS denial over the battle space. That's not the case. They are constantly working on trying to mitigate that by updating the weapon systems. There's a number of other things afoot here to try and mitigate this. Small diameter bomb, which we just learned has arrived. That was reportedly 90% effective. I would caveat that by saying that it's a system that is just newly arrived, probably not that many numbers. So we're likely working with a small sample size here. So I wouldn't necessarily expect that you're going to see over going forward that small diameter bomb is going to have a 90% effective rate. But it's a constant evolution here with regard to electronic warfare. And I'll just conclude by saying that my next column for the Insider is about electronic warfare. So stay tuned for that. There'll be much more to say on the topic when that gets published.
Hey, Colby, I was doing my news report and I was just reading Militarny articles like I do. And I saw they quoted you as a source for one of the articles. I don't know, did you know that before I pointed it out to you?
I did see that, yes. Not the first time they've used me as the source. So it's always interesting to see. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's good. I like Militarny. They're always great. So it's good to see them using reliable sources over here at Tochnyi. So yeah, so I think from there we're going to go ahead and wrap up the stream there. Thanks everyone for attending the live broadcast, and also of course if you're tuning in later with the video on demand, we appreciate everyone stopping by and listening, and thanks for liking and subscribing to Tochnyi, liking the stream. Go ahead, Aaron.
Joseph, I forgot. I promised. We really need to help promoting this. So basically, Andrew, which is one of our associates, and as many of you know, he is a mapper. He makes this map, and it's been really difficult for him and his team to keep up because there is just too much things being published and too much stuff to log and geolocate, and he needs help. So if you're interested in volunteering, you can go to tochnyi.info, and there's a link on the top of the website which says join Andrew Perpetuus project, and there's some information about what help we need there, and there's a contact form. So if you're interested, please sign up and we can have a chat and figure out if there is any way you can help.
Yep, it's an absolutely massive project. I mean, if you think about every video has to be checked that it's not a repeat of every previous video. So that means every time there's a new video, it gets infinitely more difficult every time to cross-reference all the videos. So yeah, it's a huge task. And of course, the usage of FPV drones and other things are exponentially increasing as well. I remember it was reported by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry this week that their use of FPV drones has increased fourfold. I don't know, Daniela, if you want to comment on that. Yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I can comment with the graph. Just give me 1 second. I can take it.
Yeah, we're close to wrapping up, but yeah, we can do this. But yeah, I just want to know if that was and you think that's accurate basically, or does that comport with your findings, or is it different? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't know. I think is quite on spot, and probably, I mean, the data that we have is going to match, not exactly the number, but the trend for sure. At least for Ukrainian.
Gotcha. So I'll let you try to pull that up, but maybe I'll kind of continue with my closeout. Is that cool? Okay?
I can show.
Yeah, go ahead. Well, so we'll close out with that graph. That'll be sort of the picture of the week, as or not. Well, that's not. We already showed Bionati's picture of the week, but that'll be we'll close out on that image the graph. But yeah, so please, if you want to support the research and the work that we do here at Tochnyi, there we go. There's the beautiful graph. Please do subscribe to the channel. Check us out on Twitter. We do post some things there occasionally, but definitely on YouTube, where we do the majority of our streaming. And yeah, please follow all the guys who make the contributions here, like Germany to Ukraine, like Colby, Daniela. All their work is really fantastic. So yeah, check them out. And yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.